Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that works on both Android and Apple phones, unlike some other apps I know. And how are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, not bad. I've had a nice weekend playing video games. I went and robbed Hephaestus, as you do. I'm catching up on Assassin's Creed games from far too many years ago. But I've had a lot of fun relaxing this weekend. I feel like it's the first weekend I've relaxed in a while. Like, a lot's going on.
Yeah, it has, hasn't it? A lot has gone on, and that's kind of the theme of today's podcast. A lot has gone on, and I'm going to try and catch us up on some things, at least UK first, and then if we've got time, see if we can move on to the USA.
This is kind of like a bumper headlines episode, really.
Yeah, kind of, because, last week we talked about Black Lives Matter, and that is still very much in the news. I've been spending most of my week catching up on sport, because sport is back, if you haven't noticed.
I'm aware, because one time I tracked like the England football scores or something. Mm-hmm. My phone decided to tell me about all of the fixtures that were happening this week, and I'm like, I'm sorry, Google, I'm not. Football's not my thing.
Yeah, it's been incredible. Had the footballers doing the Black Lives Matter take the knee stance on the pitch, and all the players' names have been replaced with Black Lives Matter. And to their credit, Sky Sports have done an incredible job talking about the movement in a way I didn't think possible for a sports broadcaster. They've been really open and honest. They've had black footballers on there talking about their experiences, and it's telling that every single black footballer they've had on has experienced racism in some way, shape, or form. Even players playing today, they've highlighted Raheem Sterling, who has had a tough time in the media in particular, and him saying that ultimately he realised it wasn't anything to do with his ability as a player, but because of the colour of his skin. And to have those candid conversations an hour before the match, where usually you just have an angry man in a studio arguing about why a centre-back didn't track back, it's like, it's refreshing to see, and it's really nice to see. So yeah, that's been my week, just catching up with sport and getting used to the weird, eerie silence of a football stadium, or fake crowd noise, which sounds like a FIFA game where they've just clicked a button and the crowd all cheers at the right time. Yeah, that's been me.
So talking about sport, I think we should probably move on to our first proper story, which is I believe we have a new Prime Minister, and he is a footballer.
Yes. Marcus Rashford, or Daniel Rashford, if you are the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, who...
He's not getting names right at all, is he? Ever.
No.
It's become a thing on Dead Ringers. That's how you know he's actually doing it far too often.
I didn't realise that. I should listen to Dead Ringers again. I think he blamed that he was thinking of Harry Potter. So, like, Daniel Radcliffe, kind of, yeah. Anyway.
Still not okay. It's not hard to be briefed on people's names.
So, yeah, this is the story in the Times, which was Rashford 1, PM 0. Player wins school meals battle. This was the story that the England and Manchester United striker Marcus Rashford had basically succeeded in forcing a government U-turn, allowing them to, basically forcing the government to provide free school meals during holiday time or the summer break. There is a little bit of background to this story. So on April 4th, Matt Hancock, who's the Health Secretary, was basically having a pop at footballers on one of the daily briefings. It had been announced after the furlough scheme was put into use that some Premier League clubs had decided to put some of their staff on furlough wages, which the government thought, hold on a second, you've got players who are earning thousands and thousands of pounds every week. Surely some of those could forego their wages to pay the backroom staff rather than the government having to pay up. And Matt Hancock's own words were, given the sacrifices that many people are making, including some of my colleagues in the NHS who have made the ultimate sacrifice, I think the first thing that Premier League footballers can do is make a contribution, take a pay cut, and play their part. That play their part bit was really taken to heart by some footballers, in particular Marcus Rashford, who joined up with a charity, FareShare, to help raise over £20 million to help about 3 million, but I think he updated it today on Twitter to 3.7 million, to get free school meals for children while schools were closed. Because usually what is a thing, children who, are unable to get the meals provided at home are able to get free meals through schools through a voucher scheme. And because COVID had cleared all the schools out, had closed them, that left some very vulnerable children unable to access that help. And Marcus said that when he was growing up, he was a child who had to partake in one of these schemes, and this was his way of giving back. And of course, it was a huge amount of money to raise and affected a large amount of people. So naturally, when the schools started to go back, but also the summer holidays are on the horizon, Marcus then made a big Twitter campaign to try and pressure the government into extending that scheme over the summer holidays to keep supporting those children. And it made front pages. There was a big push on BBC Breakfast, and it was one of those very few campaigns, I think, that you just see gather momentum that just wasn't stopped, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was, like you say, it was one of those things where, as someone who doesn't follow football at all, I had no idea who Marcus Rashford was, because even though he's, Man United, that's a big club, I've heard of them, but I wouldn't have known who he was because I don't keep up with the current teams. And then, he was basically a household name. I mean, I'm sure he was a household name in some households, but he's a household name for everyone now because of what he's done here.
Yeah, precisely. It's one of those things that pierces a political bubble. I feel if it was Keir Starmer doing it or somebody within the Labour Party, it may have been dismissed as more partisan by the Conservatives. However, because you've got a player who never really gets involved in politics and was in particular saying his message on Twitter saying this isn't about partisanship, this is about getting meals for vulnerable kids, which is kind of one of, arguably one of the most worthy causes going. It seemed bizarre that the government was pushing back on this. And even as early as Tuesday, there was a message from the PM's office that said the Prime Minister understands the issues affecting families across the UK, which is why in the last week the government announced an additional 63 million for local authorities to benefit families who are struggling to afford food and other basic essentials. Undeterred, Marcus Rashford went on and said no to the government, this isn't good enough. And eventually, the next day, Boris Johnson was forced in the daily briefing to say, no, we've reversed our position. We are going to allow, I think it's an extra £120 million of funding to extend this scheme over the summer holidays. Seen as a massive victory for, people power and the ability to, affect the government, but also kind of going on to the theme of what this government has been doing during this crisis. I just wanted to highlight how it's
another U-turn.
Yes, precisely. This is a government that seems to be reacting to events rather than controlling them, and got a few other examples. Oh, yeah, sorry, before I move on, I just wanted to talk about the headline the next day, which made the government's actions feel a little even more hypocritical. It was in the Metro, which was the PM's £1 million paint job. Have you heard about the big flag we want to paint on the plane?
Yeah, so this is like our equivalent of Air Force One, isn't it? It's the plane that the Prime Minister flies around the world in for various events. Obviously, not very much at the moment, but in general. And I believe it's going to be painted red, white and blue into the British flag. And it's going to cost a lot of money because plain paint is expensive.
Is one of those, it was a story that was a real juxtaposition to the free school meals for children scandal. What is the more worthy cause? Food for children who cannot afford it, or paint your plane nice colours? It did seem to, again, paint the government as this, having their priorities not quite in the right place. There was a side story that one way to boost Britain's morale was to commission a new yacht.
Oh, this comes up every few years. Let's build a new royal yacht. The Queen doesn't need another yacht.
Yeah.
Oh, well, doesn't need a yacht. Full stop. She had one many years ago. I don't think anyone our age actually even remembers it. So it's a weird political thing where I think the average person goes, why does the Queen need a yacht? The Queen can perfectly afford to get flown everywhere. What's it's a very weird kind of tail end of empire thing that doesn't mean anything to anyone our age.
Yeah, and it's being tied into the whole Brexit argument, as is this plane now, as in, okay, now we need to sell ourselves to the rest of the world. We need a matching uniform. We need a kit. We need something to show off to people when we visit Australia. And what better way to do it than a fancy plane and a nice yacht to try and negotiate trade deals with?
A massive yacht. One of the best sketches from Mitchell Webb. A massive. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of a bit of. I understand that there is a certain amount of pomp and circumstance that goes on with being a government and travelling abroad and all of this. And like you get similar stories. I'm sure there was one when I think it was President Trump bought a load of new pens, and people were complaining about how expensive it was. But actually, when you compared it to Obama's pen purchase, it's basically the same. Basically, every time there's a new president, they buy a load of pens to give away as gifts. And of course, it's expensive because they're buying like this many thousand quite fancy pens. I think there's always this kind of discussion to be had about what is necessary. I mean, because all of these things are always expensive. You know, painting the average person never has to get their plane repainted. So, like, I have no idea if £900,000 is a good price for having an entire plane repainted. Who knows? I have no idea. And I think because they're big numbers, much more than people earn a year, they get these kind of stories easily get bandied around as like, oh, well, look, the government is not spending appropriately.
Yeah, totally. It was just, I think that if you were looking for, I talk about optics a lot on this podcast, if you were looking for a good time to announce that, maybe the day after, giving children free school meals wasn't the best day to try and drop that bombshell on us.
Yeah, maybe give it a few days so it can be hidden behind some other news. Yeah. So next up, as alluded to in our opening gag this evening, we were going to make an app. It was going to be the best app, and it wasn't going to do anything that Google and Apple were telling the government to do. Why did that not work out?
Because we didn't.
Than the obvious.
yeah. Well, why it didn't is still kind of shrouded in a little bit of mystery because we've tried to brush it under the carpet. But as you alluded to, Matt Hancock announced in early April, I believe, that we were going to have an app to track and trace people who have had COVID. You know, if you've been tested positive for COVID, this app on your phone would basically track everybody who you'd been in contact with in the past 2 weeks or the incubation period of the virus, give them a message and tell them to self-isolate. We've been talking about this working quite well in places like South Korea and Singapore, where they've effectively been able to, you know, do this, and instead of you having to do a massive nationwide lockdown, you can lock down in small bubbles, and that's much less disruptive on the whole, and is the most effective way of keeping cases low if you're able to accurately do so. The Prime Minister had also said that it was going to be world-beating, which, you know, talk up your own app, sure, but maybe, you know, with a slight caveat of some expectation management. That's it. You don't want to build everybody's hopes up. You might know, being in the tech sphere, do you know about like the whole plan under the Labour government to put all of the NHS on one computer system?
I'm aware of how that was bungled, yes, and how it costs a lot of money. I don't know all of the details, but I am definitely aware of it as a kind of how not to do things story.
Yes, it's such a how not to do things story that basically one of my nephews said that it was used as a case study at his university for like a how you don't run one of these projects. So the NHS does have a bit of a muddy history with, you know, new technology and IT, but instead we decided to forge ahead, and as you mentioned, we did that without the help of Apple and Google, who had been the ones that had helped everybody else in the world with their tracing apps, essentially. This app was touted. There was a news story a couple of weeks ago about the training for how people were going to use this app.
Because it had been rolled out on the Isle of Wight, right? Like that was the big thing I heard first.
Yes, so it was rolled out on the Isle of Wight, and the government hailed it as a massive success, basically, because they've been able to get 60% of the population to sign up, which is good. You know, one of the big things that you need to happen if track and trace is going to work is for everybody to sign up. But equally, when the government says download this app on your phone, some people quite rightly have privacy questions. And, you know, how is this information going to be used? Is it just going to be used for Corona, or are you going to track my movements in another way? So there is like a big trust issue for the government, and maybe that's one of the reasons why they didn't want to involve Google or Apple, because they were worried how that data would be used.
Well, I think this is kind of where the crux of this matter comes in, because, I mean, Google and Apple very rarely work together on things. They are competitors. And I think this is where that there are many, many podcasts going into this in depth, because this was the discussion maybe a month ago when this was all being talked about. So, for example, in the US, they have basically said they can do apps statewide, and they had a similar thing where they're like, well, my state's going to produce this app, and that'll be it. No need for Google and Apple to get involved. People don't trust Google and Apple, blah, 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 that kind of stuff about privacy. what Google and Apple did was they got together. They said, okay, this is going to be the standard. It's going to work between Android and iPhones because that basically covers pretty much everyone because no one owns a BlackBerry anymore. In all honesty, there's Android and Apple cover the majority of the market in most countries. The idea was they got together, collaborated, worked out how this would work, and also, importantly, set security standards for it. So this data can't be just shared with anyone. You can't use it to track someone's location. It can only be used to find out if they were near other unique IDs. So with this, in tech, this idea of unique identifiers, which is just like a number that is definitely that device. And you can be like, well, was I ever near this device? As opposed to what was your GPS location all the way through the day, which is a completely different set of data. So Google and Apple released these were like, we're working on these standards. Please don't make any apps. And also, I think they took the measure of essentially banning any apps that did this from their various stores. So that's another blocker. And some people did moan about this, oh, is this okay? But in general, I think you'll see the countries where they have used an app based on the Google and Apple system that they've been actually like, oh, actually, this is really good. They thought about the security. They've really helped us. And then our government was just like, no, we're not going to do that. We'll do our own thing. It'll be better based on what... I mean, there are some very talented people working in the government in all these technology areas, but they're not as big as Apple and Google. And so the idea that they could achieve something on par, and I don't know if you've used other government apps, but they're not the best. I mean, like there's the council tax app and things like that. They're basically just load a web page. They're not particularly clever. It's not at all surprising to me that this was a complete failure. I don't know if you want to add on some points, but I had heard, but I haven't had a chance to look into this and follow it up, that this was another kind of Dominic Cummings plan, and one of the people making the app or doing a fair amount of the app development were some of his chums, which obviously leads into our previous discussions about Dominic Cummings not necessarily being a force for good within this government.
Yes, I believe I had heard that. It was only a headline, so not enough to have read the article. So unfortunately, I don't want to go into too much depth. But I remember the headline saying something along the lines of basically the same people behind like the Vote Leave data mining stuff or similar tech companies were the ones given the contract. So maybe that is another reason why it failed. The only thing I wanted to add really was when I was researching this and having a look up, why it failed. It was promised the 1st of June and never came, so it was something that was going to be pushed back. The stories behind the training were awful as well. People said they were just paid to be on Zoom for 8 hours, waiting for training that never came. And there was quite a damning article in The Guardian about that. And then finally, I think the big one that came up is when they did the test on the Isle of Wight, it failed to detect 96% of contacts with Apple iPhones. And if you're missing that large percentage of people, and I think, I know Apple isn't quite as big over here as it is in the States, but still, I have an iPhone, I would be missed off. So, what's the point of even having that app in the first place if there's a 96% chance it's going to miss me?
I mean, I don't know how many friends you have, but if you got together 25 of your friends, assuming they all owned iPhones, and said, oh, it's only going to work for one of you, that's pretty awful. I mean, I know people are bad at phrasing percentages, but normally, but 96%, pretty big percentage of not working.
Pretty embarrassing for the government there, and another U-turn that was kind of forced. Maybe we could all foresee it coming a lot longer than the government did, but crucially, when we're at a stage now where we are coming out of lockdown, I believe like the level was reduced over the weekend, so that opened up a whole new variety of things people can do, and certainly from the photos I've seen online or anecdotes I've heard from people who are, going to the cities, social distancing appears to be over anyway, as people's, ability to, follow the rules in all situations seems to have gone down. This would have been a really good time to have that app working. If, as the headline in the Independent suggests, that we won't have an app working until December, then that's a lot of lost time for a virus that we already know. We knew about that virus in February, and a month later we were locked down. If we have a second spike without that app, that's a big deal. So
our next topic on U-turns, another one related to the health service, the NHS Surcharge. So can you explain what that is? Because I don't know if everyone actually knows what it is. It sounds like, on the face of it, it sounds like paying more to access the NHS, which I'm not sure that's what it is at all.
No, so it applies to people who are working for the NHS. So if you're a non-EU national and you come and work for the NHS, as part of you signing up for that, you pay a £400 fee as a surcharge for the benefit of having a job in the NHS. As a historical matter, and it was brought to people's attention, particularly during COVID, that these people are literally putting their lives on the line now. It does seem a little bit unfair for them to be paying £400 for the privilege. This was kind of an example of a Labour-led U-turn. I think this was one where Keir Starmer really took the lead on it and essentially forced the Prime Minister into a U-turn in PMQs. And this is another thing that we're going to talk about. There have been other U-turns that Keir Starmer has come prepared to grill the government, and Boris Johnson's response has been, actually, we're U-turning on that. We're going to go back and we're going to get rid of that surcharge. It was even brought up in PMQs last week, or this Wednesday, where Keir said, you said you were going to do this, but actually there are people still paying the fee. And the Prime Minister was forced to say, well, yes, because essentially because they'd had to work so quickly to get that U-turn in place, nobody had officially got rid of the surcharge, so they are going to reimburse those who paid the surcharge in between the time PM announced that they were abolishing it. But it's kind of I would say that this is a show that Boris Johnson isn't very good at PMQs if he feels his only way to defend himself is to do constant U-turns, because it does suggest a slight sort of weakness in his leadership. And secondly, it shows how big unifying factors like the NHS, I think you remember during lockdown, like the applause and everything, and the NHS has got a heightened status throughout this crisis. Now people are looking at some of the kind of odder things that we did in the NHS. I didn't know about this surcharge until it was brought up, but it does seem unfair that you have to pay for the privilege of working when actually we want to recruit as many doctors and nurses as possible into the NHS. So, yeah, it's another flashpoint.
And yeah, another U-turn in this list, the bereavement scheme for doctors and nurses who die from COVID. How did this work exactly? As well, again, another thing I'm not very read up on myself.
This was similar to the above. Essentially, it was another sort of odd loophole that the government had. They set up a bereavement scheme that said doctors and nurses, if they died from COVID, their family could stay in the UK if they weren't a UK national. However, this didn't apply to other NHS workers in other positions, such as porters, cleaners, etc. Typically those on less money who could, were equally putting themselves at risk by doing important jobs in the hospital. It wasn't seem fair that they weren't given the same rights as doctors and nurses when they were putting their bodies on the line. So quite rightly, the government decided to do a U-turn on that and say that the charge applied to all NHS workers. Again, another sensible U-turn, and again, another one featuring around the NHS where people seem, there is a spotlight on the NHS and people want to make sure things are as fair as possible. However, again, it does make the government seem a little bit weak in that sense by having to, why didn't they think of this? Maybe not weak, but ill-prepared. Why didn't they think of that before when you have such an obvious hole in that? The bereavement scheme was created specifically for COVID. You must know that not only doctors and nurses will be affected by this in hospitals. Why not extend it and save yourself a lot of trouble? It seemed short-sighted on the government. And
I think our final one in the list is remote voting for MPs. So there was a lot of talk when this first happened. So we had the remote PMQs and things like that. So with social distancing in force, you obviously can't get the vast majority of MPs into the chamber because, it was designed, I think, if correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the chamber was designed with something like 450 MPs in mind, maybe 500. And then was maybe updated a bit, but we now have 625 MPs or thereabouts. So it's already a bit hard to get everyone in there normally, and with social distancing, it's just not possible. It's like, it's like our buses now can only take 8 passengers because when you have to be 2 meters distanced in all directions, it's really hard in an enclosed space. So we had all these online PMQs, and there were some online votes, and then quite quickly, Mogg pops up and says, "Oh no, that's it. You've got to come in and vote." And there was this massive conga line outside of Parliament, as everyone had to keep 2 meters social distancing to vote on issues.
Yeah, and again, it was an odd move. Particularly, it seemed to be spearheaded by Jacob Rees-Mogg, who was maybe the man the Conservatives wanted to lead that one, because his argument was sort of, well, it's tradition, and if there's anything that Jacob Rees-Mogg does well, it's, pointing at something from the 1890s and said, we did it that way back then, why don't we still do it that way now? Another reason people thought that Mogg wanted to bring people back into the chamber was because Boris had been performing poorly at Prime Minister's questions, and they felt he needed a bit more jeering, the whole, our tradition of if they went like that behind Boris Johnson, maybe some of his points would come across as more coherent. I disagree on that point, but still, that's what he thought. So he implemented this voting system that got nicknamed the Mogg Conga, because you had this huge line of MPs lining up. At some places it wasn't effective. There was a part where they had to go down an escalator and people started to bunch up at the bottom. So it seemed to make the whole thing a bit of a farce. It also took ages to do. It took MPs, I think if you needed all of them to vote, it took them about like half an hour to 45 minutes to go through the whole process. So the whole thing took about 45 minutes. And even during this in the queue, you had backbench Conservative MPs openly disagreeing with the policy, only to go ahead and vote on it, which seemed bizarre, but they were well whipped. But a lot of Conservative MPs voted for it because, one, they were whipped and didn't want to go against the government, but two, it was very easily undermined. Even former Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, put on Twitter that if he was a cheeky Labour whip or somebody who wanted to show how silly the system was, you could just put through a load of motions, amendments to a bill and force them all to be voted on, and you could spend an entire day just voting on these amendments to get them rejected. Everybody could see, one, how silly it was, and two, the big problem was that Jacob Rees-Mogg didn't allow people to vote virtually. They couldn't do it online. You had to be there in person, and there were a lot of MPs who thought that this denied them their right to vote when they might be shielding for a certain position or acting as a carer in certain cases, or not wanting to make the trip down from their remote constituency down to London to vote during times where people were being told off for non-essential travel. So eventually that was one that was overturned again in PMQs. Boris Johnson just announced that the government was now looking into making sure that people could vote online again. That was another bizarre one, because again, it's the government making a rod for its own back. That was one where even its own MPs could very clearly see that system wasn't going to work. They voted on it anyway, and then were forced into a quick U-turn when everybody could see how silly it was, having enacted it. I think they only did it once, the full Mogg vote, which really goes to show that, it was a failure.
So we've outlined a number of different U-turns that have all come with different reasons, and I think you started to allude to the idea that this is a particular problem in the Johnson government itself. Do you want to say a bit more on that? Because I mean, my first impression is that it's not surprising to me that with Boris's style of kind of bluster and saying things a lot, that it's not surprising he would say one thing and have to suddenly say the next thing the next day because of his style. But also it does seem to be becoming a very regular pattern now, where they're saying we'll do one thing and suddenly something else. And how long does it take for the number of U-turns to start to undermine a government's trustworthiness, if you trusted them in the first place?
So, I think you're right there that Boris's style does lend itself to U-turns, particularly at the dispatch box, where he does seem to act off the cuff a little bit more rather than have planned statements. It's very easy for him to misspeak and have to go back on that. You can see this as Boris's time as Foreign Secretary over the Nazarene Zaghiri-Ratcliffe fiasco, where essentially Boris Johnson said something to the effect that she was a spy. I think that was right, or essentially undermined the whole UK's argument for getting her out there under false spy charges, as we attested, but misspoke and undermined her safety, and is in a situation where she was still in Iranian jail, I think, until coronavirus hit. when she was
Yeah,
released.
I think she was released this year, right? So
yes. Yeah, and that was back from his time as Foreign Secretary back in 2017. Yes, there we go. Yeah, he was urged to correct a statement that she was working in Iran rather than being on holiday in Iran, suggesting that she was working kind of undermined a whole lot of British argument about why she'd been detained incorrectly. So Boris's style and the way that he conducts himself does lead itself to more U-turns. There's another problem with the way that Boris, I think, has constructed his cabinet, in the way that he has rewarded loyalty rather than skill. Now, I know this seems harsh, but I think you can see it with the way that, this was a cabinet that was prepared for Brexit, and Boris Johnson had been a relative outsider in the Conservative government until Theresa May essentially had failed to get Brexit done on time, and Boris got what was a relatively small group of loyalists to him who believed in the Brexit cause to rally round him, and that's how he was able to win a massive Conservative majority. They were ready for a Brexit government that would kind of try and, I don't want to say bluster their way through the cabinet, but they're a very combative set of individuals who are willing to sort of stare facts down if needed to force the European Union into a place where they would accept their deal. They're not so good with a factual virus. We've kind of covered this when we were talking about Trump's ability to counter the virus and how he would deal with it. The Boris Johnson government is similar in a lot of ways. And that disorganized cabinet, along with their lack of ability in some aspects, means that you get daft decisions being made or things overlooked. I know Matt Hancock's got a lot on his plate at the moment, but forgetting about those workers in the bereavement scheme, or allowing there to be a surcharge still to be paid for non-EU workers, looks really bad when the NHS is going through a crisis. We've already talked about how Mogg's crisis was almost entirely, self-made by Jacob Rees-Mogg trying to get something traditional back into government and trying to do a bit of a PR exercise, really, by saying, look, politicians are back, people should now go back into schools and businesses should reopen. That was kind of the PR exercise they were going for. However, in reality, you still have to shield people, you still have to keep 2 meter distance. There are things that prevent you from things going back to normal. So, yeah, again, that forced, the government had to face facts and turn back on that original plan. Finally, you've got a lot of new Conservative MPs who came from old Labour constituencies who are really worried that, things that are perceived to be unfair, those, school meals, for example, and those charges on NHS workers, that's something that old Labour constituencies would care a lot more about than those traditional Conservative constituencies. Combine that with the effect of coronavirus putting an added spotlight on the NHS, and you've got the perfect cocktail for a government that is suddenly under the spotlight, not only from the public saying that they demand a U-turn, but its own backbenchers for fear that they're going to lose more voters. We've already talked about how the Conservatives are struggling in the polls somewhat. They're not behind Labour yet, but they've lost an awful lot of the good faith that they built up when they won that sort of landslide victory back in December. They want to try and hold on to it. So these U-turns are a way of trying to keep voters on side. However, at the same time, it also undermines your style of leadership. Do you stick to your guns? Did you elect Boris Johnson to stand up for his rights, whatever? Trump's very, if you want to take Trump as an example, Trump never backs down. Trump probably should back down on a lot of occasions, but he doesn't back down from his point of view and always seems to double down and go on the attack. That's kind of one of the reasons why Trump supporters keep very loyal to Trump, because he's steadfast, even in the face of facts and reason. He sticks to his opinion. So does Boris, stick to his guns in the same way? Or does he U-turn, which is seen sensible by some people? I think a lot of us would agree that the things that he's U-turned on, it's good that children get free school meals. It's good that this surcharge is gone. It's good that doctors and nurses who die, their families get to stay in the UK. It's great that people who are unable to vote in Parliament physically because they are shielded now can do so, which means you have the chance for democracy to be enacted. They're all good decisions, but you have to question maybe why the government thought it was a good idea to do the opposite in the first place. And the more U-turns you do, the more it highlights bad government decision-making that got them to the place where we had to U-turn in the first place. So, not a great time for Johnson, not a great time for the Conservatives, as we mentioned before when we were talking about their polling numbers going down. And the kind of bad thing for the Conservatives is it's nearly all self-inflicted. I think we've talked about Starmer going up in the ratings, but I don't think he's done anything particularly incredible to get as high as he's done. It's been entirely the government scoring own goals.
I suppose my final comment is, well, it's more of a question, is obviously they're doing poorly in the polls right now. They're not doing particularly well against coronavirus. There's multiple U-turns we've discussed. But given that we're only in the first few months of what I assume is going to be a 5-year Conservative government, because why would they call an election early if they can get away with it? Especially as that gives Keir Starmer a long leash to mess up on, potentially. I mean, I'm not saying he will. I'm just saying that at the moment, people are generally behind. You'd expect people to be behind a new leader. Boris has kind of squandered that, whereas Sir Keir has still got a lot of that impetus behind him. I think in the general impression of him, he's refreshing in PMQs, etc. So, for 4 to 5 years' time away, do you think anyone will still think on it? How relevant do you think this will be? Or do you think in 4 or 5 years' time we'll be worrying about something completely different because Brexit will be over, the coronavirus will have gone away? I know that's making some big assumptions, but what do you think things will be like in 4 to 5 years' time?
So I think I'm going to take an example from history, which is the Major government won an election they didn't expect to win in 92 and got the Conservatives to over 10 years in power. I think Maggie came in 1979, so the 92 election, they would have had 13 years of power. Everybody expected the Conservatives to lose the 92 election, and Major wins. And, oh goodness, they've got another 4 years of Conservative leadership, and they could have hung on to that coming into 1997. However, they had Black Monday happen, which was a terrible economic disaster for the UK. And even though that happened in 93, so a year into the Major administration, the sort of malaise around that incident hung with them for 4 years. And slowly, we were just all knew that Labour were the next government in waiting, and the Conservatives were terrified to call an election because they wanted to hang on to power as long as possible. And that was still from an event that happened in 1993. Now, of course, you've got New Labour and Blair and them reinventing themselves. So Labour had to also, learn the lessons from why they lost 92 so unexpectedly and so badly in their opinion. So there is still some, I would say, reform of the Labour Party that needs to happen if we're going to see a repeat of 1997. But voters proved back then that they do have very long memories. And if the government is allowed to stagnate, particularly when you're at a period where you've had an elongated phase of one party being in power. If this was the Conservatives have just come in and they were a change from Labour, I might be saying that people would be, oh, don't worry, they've only come in, that they're not responsible for... You remember when Cameron came in 2010 and people say, oh, well, the Conservatives aren't responsible for the crash, Labour are. They get a bit of slack from voters thinking that, oh yeah, no, we want to try this new thing for a while. However, it's getting very hard for the Conservatives to say that isn't our fault when the last 10 years have been Conservative policies and, austerity and all of this. It weighs heavily on people's minds. So I think that's one possibility that voters do remember, and it plays badly for Boris Johnson in 4 years' time. However, I'm going to say it, Brexit is a big thing, and it's the other big thing that we know is happening, and we know that was the one issue Boris was able to unite a core of voters around and win their favour. If Boris is able to get a good Brexit deal, or they no deal but the country somehow comes out of it, great, or he's able to have a solid core of people who are Brexit till I die, and that's 40% of the country, and they're willing to follow him wherever, then Corona and the way they've handled this crisis, people may forget. However, I don't think people are going to forget Corona in a hurry. And I don't think we've seen the last effect of this virus on the nation. So we're all waiting to see what happens with the next phase. So yeah, I think it's likely that the Johnson government is going to see a long-term effect from the way that they've handled this crisis, and it probably has, in my opinion, derailed them for the foreseeable future. It's derailed all of us, hasn't it? In a sense, all of our plans have been put to one side. But you make comparisons with other countries and how they've handled it, and I think it's fairly clear that we've done quite a poor job.
So join us after a quick ad for another show for our update on the polls and how Trump's faring in the USA.
Good evening and welcome to the bar. Join Dr. Wilko as he investigates the histories of your favourite spirits and your favourite cocktails while mixing you a drink at the bar. The other bars may be closed, but a podcast bar will always remain open.
So now it's time for our quick polls update, where once again we're going across the pond to look at the possibility of Biden or Trump winning the general election in the USA, which is getting closer by the day now.
Yeah, if we didn't have Corona, this would be when you would really start focusing on the polls and they'd start to matter, because the election would be end of October, 1st of November. Let me just... Oh, God, I can't remember. It's first week of November, isn't it, the election?
I think so. Yeah, so, I mean, having a quick glance at the polls, the June 19th numbers, they're actually quite quick on the polls in the US. The current rolling average is Biden on 50.4% and Trump on 41.5%, which is, I mean, that's quite a gap still, and that is consistent. And if you look back, this link will be in the show notes again and probably a picture. If you look back, initially the gap between them in March was about 4%. And it has slowly widened, but in all that time it's been widening, there have been polls that put Biden below Trump and Trump above Biden. And then you kind of average it out. Whereas I think this is the first time where maybe about the 7th of June is, I think, the first time when all of the red polls, i.e. Trump, are below all of the blue polls that are Biden, and they've kind of separated out. So that's quite interesting, because that shows the gap widening, as far as, if I'm reading it correctly. Yeah, no,
it's just interesting that you mention early June for when those polls start to go wrong for Trump, because if you have a look at the approval rating for Donald Trump as well.
Oh, wow, yeah. So, again, June 3rd is when Trump's initial approval rating was above his disapproval rating all the way back in January 2017, how long ago it was. And then over time, his disapprove came up, and there was this kind of big bulge in those early scandals. And then it kind of leveled back down together as a bit of a bump in February 2019, which I have a feeling that wasn't impeachment. Was that around Kavanaugh? I can't even remember anymore.
That might have been, oh gosh, there's so much that's gone on. It might have been impeachment.
January 2019, because impeachment was this year, right?
Yeah, January.
Yeah, so January a year ago was his peak disapproval at 55.9%. And then it kind of settled back down again. And then it actually got, in March, I don't know what he did at the end of March, probably when he was kind of doing some of his rallying talk around having, people can go back out again and stuff. But before all of the Black Lives Matter protests and the discussion we had last time, he got back to only 50% disapproval, 45% approval. And then it's been steadily, from kind of April onwards, been kind of steadily going against him. So now we're back at 55% disapproval, which is, it's 55.2% disapproval, so we're only 0.7% away from peak disapproval, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's a reflection on how Trump is losing out on a lot of the big leadership issues, and that is a big issue when it comes to a presidential election. Trump has been seen as a strongman leader who's been able to bluster his way through most crises, but we've talked about how he's struggled with Corona to deal with that crisis in a way that, he usually would. The other one that he's really struggled with is the Black Lives Matter protests, and it's about at that time where you start to see that spike go up. We've talked about, last time about his divisive actions, his tear gassing of his own protesters, the protesters outside of the White House, his threat of, increasing, upping the ante by increasing the amount of force that was on the streets by saying maybe the military could get involved. A lot of people saying that that's not presidential behavior in a time where we need leadership that unites us the most. So I think it's a combination of all those factors that is driving that disapproval rating up. He's also got a myriad of other scandals that are happening at the moment, or embarrassments for him. So very briefly, the things I just wanted to touch on are he's lost 2 Supreme Court cases this week, on civil rights on one, and the other one was on his ruling that it was an Obama administration ruling that said that the people who'd come to America as children of undocumented migrants, they can now stay in the USA because it wasn't their fault that they came in undocumented. And because they've lived here for over 16 years, they'll have a right to stay in the USA. Trump said Obama had acted unconstitutionally and said that he would pull that. However, when it got to the Supreme Court said, no, you can't just pull it, mate. You've got to put at least some provision for these people to, get funding or help them move on to another place. So that's kind of undermined Trump's message as somebody who can undo the Obama administration's work when it comes to immigration. Also, him losing the Supreme Court case, which was on the rights of the LGBT community. Essentially, it dates back to a 1964 Civil Rights Act that said you can't be discriminated against on the grounds of race, sex, gender, age, etc., nationality, but it never covered sexuality because that was something that they didn't really account for in 1964. People have been arguing that it should do, and that affects employment law. Trump felt that it didn't, and many thought that the Supreme Court would go with Trump on this one because he's had the power to appoint 2 Supreme Court justices while he's been in charge. That was one of the big reasons he won in 2016, if you remember, that some Republicans were worried that Obama would get to appoint a 3rd Supreme Court judge. So the Republican Senate blocked that until Trump got into power, and then he could appoint his own. Neil Gorsuch was the first one he appointed. However, Neil Gorsuch voted in favour of upholding the 1964 Civil Rights Act and applying that to sexuality, which seems to have undermined one of Trump's reasons for putting him in there.
It is an interesting point, though, because I think a lot of people have been going, oh, look at these, conservative judges. I think a lot of people see the judges as a bit more political than they are. They can act in a political way because they set a precedent. So I mean, obviously, everyone is affected by their own political opinions, but I think it's clear if you look at those opinions that this is done on I'm not going to get the right legal term here, but basically it's done on the kind of like, these are the rules, we should follow the rules, like upholding what is the literal law, and that this doesn't necessarily mean this is going to help out in other cases. Like this isn't like, oh, these 2 conservative justices are actually secretly liberal justices. It's more that it's basically that in all of these things, Trump's administration has been sloppy, and essentially that the TLDR of these opinions is, do it right. Like, don't mess this up. How did you get this wrong? You have a team of lawyers. Is the big TLDR of that. So I think it has been a bit of hope for people, and obviously these rulings are important, especially the LGBT ruling we discussed. But it's not like these justices are doing things based on the letter of the law. And I've forgotten the exact term for the kind of formal way he reads things, but there's a kind of a style of being a judge in the US that he's currently adopting. It's a certain kind of mindset of judging that my brain has completely forgotten right now. But yeah, they're doing it in line with that.
Yeah, it's like Federalist or another one, or you can be like very literal about how you interpret the law and say, no, that's it. Or you can essentially say, no, this law has to be updated to our modern standards, and you can interpret it in other ways. I've also forgot the term, but yes, there we go. Literalist versus originalist. See, I'm glad we've got people who know stuff in the chat. It's really nice.
My problem is often I get to listen to my podcasts when I'm doing certain types of work. So if there's a new term, it will probably just slip right out the other side. But I'll get the general point of it. Yeah, so with those Supreme Court setbacks, coronavirus, as we say, and the ongoing Black Lives Matter movement, which, well, you know, I imagine that those protests won't be over come the election, judging by how things are going with Trump's reaction. And rightfully so. But I mean, I think that's going to be a thing he's going to have to try and face in the run-up to the election. And knowing Trump, I imagine he's going to face it in completely the wrong way.
Yes. He's the way he tried to deal with Black Lives Matter was turning it into a city versus country debate. Kind of saying, oh, these are issues that happen in the cities and these are because of weak democratic mayors and how they govern their police force. That's how he tried to frame the argument. And I don't think he's won that argument by any stretch. Maybe he's trying to appeal to his base of voters out in like the countryside and in those swing states. But by the gap that he's got in polling at the moment, that suggests that he would lose the next presidential election. Now, just because Biden's got a 10-point lead doesn't mean Biden is guaranteed to win. And listening to Nate Silver's podcast today, essentially Biden could go into the election with about like a 6-point lead and maybe still lose the electoral college if everything goes wrong. You've got to remember that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote but lost the electoral college. So Trump does put a lot of faith in winning states rather than the popular vote. However, on his current form, he's not on course to do that. And I feel it's unlikely he's going to change his tack on Black Lives Matter. Even in a recent... he did his rally in Tulsa the other day, which has hit the news for a variety of reasons. Top of the list was the fact that lots of K-pop fans and TikTokers, I believe that's the term for them. I'm sorry, young people, if I've said that wrong.
How do you do, fellow kid?
You could sign up for free tickets online. So they signed up for 1 million tickets, and Trump thought it was going to be sold out and have an outdoor arena, and then only 19,000. He didn't fill a 19,000 arena during a COVID crisis. He also decided to hold it on Juneteenth, which is a day of particular significance for the Black American community because that's a day of liberation for slaves. So again, seen as quite tin-eared and not maybe listening to the wishes of people on that day. And even on when he was talking about the Black Lives Matter movement in his speeches, he seemed to label them as like a radical left organization, that the protests are being hijacked by a radical left agenda, and Joe Biden is the one who's going to give in to that. I'm not, which doesn't seem a way to bring a country together that is clearly still hurting over the issues. So, yeah, Trump's messing up in a lot of ways. And for the first time, I think, which is reassuring as a human being, or at least for me, Trump does a lot of bad things, and then you see his approval rating is still at 40%. And a lot of me was always asking, who are these 40% of people? What will it take for them to change their mind? Or, what does he need to do? It appears now that it's getting closer to election day, and we've had 2 major crises that he's seen as, in my opinion, unable to deal with. More people are agreeing with that interpretation of events and saying, yeah, I might abandon Trump or not turn out at the next election.
Yes, no, I think it is frustrating sometimes when you watch things in politics. You're like, someone keeps doing stupid things and it's not affecting polling at all. How can this be? And you can start to feel like you're very much in a bubble. Yeah, it's good to see that there is some pushback on these, this is how politics is supposed to work, right? It's supposed to go back and forth between different parties and so on, or at least that's how it works in our 2-party systems. But yeah, it's good to see that people are starting to realise, and hopefully that will carry on into the election.
The only other thing that happened to Trump this week, which made an extra bad week, was the book release from John Bolton, who is seen as a hawkish secretary, as we call him. He got released by the Trump administration after disagreeing with Trump on a number of foreign policy issues, and his tell-all book, although it hasn't reviewed very well in the New York Times, I understand, because it's not particularly well written, some of the revelations in there are quite telling or embarrassing for Trump. Among them, I think, was that he thought Finland was still controlled by Russia. he didn't know in a visit to the UK that we were a nuclear power, which is quite embarrassing. The fact that the whole photograph in the demilitarized zone in between North Korea and South Korea was something that just came about because of a Trump tweet. Nobody else knew anything about it. He tweeted it and said, yeah, let's do it. And suddenly it was policy. And that made it seem like, yeah, it paints an image of a very dysfunctional White House with people reacting to what the president does rather than them having formulated plans, particularly when it comes to foreign policy. Maybe most damaging for the president, it also includes claims about what happened with the Ukraine scandal, which was the main basis of the impeachment allegations. For the record, John Bolton says that he doesn't think that his testimony would have changed the results of the impeachment. And in a way, I agree with him, because it seemed that Republican senators, at least, were unwilling to impeach the president no matter what he did. But the fact that John Bolton wasn't allowed to even appear as a witness in the impeachment trial does seem a little bit odd, particularly when he chose to write a book about it instead, which has led some Democrats in this case to say, yeah, you shouldn't have just held your secrets to try and sell a book. Maybe you should have tried to do the right thing and get a president you felt unfit for office impeached. So there's that book, and there's another one on the horizon, which is written by Trump's niece, Mary, which is meant to be a bit more of like a revealing tell-all and the man behind the president, the man before the president, and have a few more personal anecdotes of how, he is behind the scenes. That one may speak to the public a bit more, and the fact that it's being released, I think it's due for release only like a couple of months before the election, will be, I don't know what the world is going to look like or what rallies or how debates are going to look like during that time. But certainly the world will be watching to see who the next president of the United States is. If something like that drops with 2 months to go, that's the kind of thing that can have a big impact and swing the campaign. And it seems to be a very negative view of Trump, and coming from a family member, somebody who's not meant to criticize you no matter what, that could be equally damaging.
So in summary, Trump's polls not so great, but still at this stage, I think we have to take everything with a bit of a pinch of salt, as you say, because it's the Electoral College that matters. But if that base starts to come down, that could really affect it. So as always, Rob, thank you for joining me. Thank you, listeners, for joining us and supporting our podcast. You can do the usual things of sharing the podcast with people you like, people you think will be interested in it. You can share it as a podcast link is always the best. You can send people to our website, parliamentary.observer, and you can find us on Reddit, on Facebook. Come and comment on things. Come and comment on the website. That's always appreciated. And of course, you can rate and subscribe us on whatever podcast app you're using. That all helps. And you can support us at patreon.com/TTSS. I think there's nothing further to me to say than it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him. Bye.
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 Bye. Bye.
Bye.
I just realised there was something I did forget to say. And that is that Helle's Marble Runs, the 2020 opening ceremony is up.
Get in.
Get in.
I was watching, there was some fun ones the other day, and I've been watching the Cravendale ones. Seems a bit corporate, that one. He's sold out, but still, I'm glad he's making his money somehow.
Cravendale on one side, John Oliver on the other. so yeah, that's awesome. Pane plaint is expensive.
Apparently so.
Hi. Have you ever wondered what would happen if you took the schoolyard conversation of which one of my favourite fictional characters would win in a fight? Well, wonder no more. Join me, Chris, and my co-host Matt every other Sunday for Mish Mash Mayhem, and you can find out.